Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to unpack the stories behind the headlines, give you the full picture. And today, we're diving headfirst into something that sounds like a real contradiction. A paradox, really. It's shaking up global politics, sure, but it could also be, hitting your wallet right now. You'd think economic sanctions, especially tough ones, would cripple a nation's economy, right? That's the whole point. Well, get this. What if a country under some of the harshest U.S. pressure isn't just surviving, it's actually booming? We are talking about Iran. Their oil exports have reportedly quadrupled in just 4 years, hitting something like $78 billion. Staggering. Now look, this isn't just some number on a spreadsheet. This surge in cash, sources allege, it directly fuels Iran's proxy networks. We're talking groups like the Houthis. You see them in the news, disrupting global trade in the Red Sea. They're attacking ships, messing with supply chains. And yeah, that ultimately drives up inflation. For you, for me, at the checkout, at the gas pump. It connects distant events right back to our daily lives. It's pretty stark.
It really is. And what's fascinating or maybe alarming is that this isn't just, Iran getting lucky or finding a temporary fix. No, our sources suggest they've systematically built what people are calling a shadow economy, a really sophisticated sanctions-proof system. Yeah. And this blueprint, it's heavily enabled by partners, China, most critically. Yeah. It lets Iran basically bypass traditional U.S. economic leverage.
Wow.
Yeah. And it raises a huge question, doesn't it? Is America's main weapon, these economic sanctions, is it losing its punch? And what does that mean for global influence? Are we heading towards a sort of post-dollar world where countries can just operate outside the U.S. system?
That's exactly the challenge we're digging into today. I mean, imagine this nation, right? Under intense sanctions, yet its oil is flowing, funding chaos, challenging the U.S. That's the surprising reality of Iran, and it's definitely more complex than it looks on the surface. So today, we're taking that deep dive into the messy, contradictory world of U.S.-Iran relations. We're pulling from various sources, trying to unpack how effective American pressure really is, how Iran's managed this resilience, and how the whole geopolitical map is shifting.
Exactly. Our mission here is to understand why. Why, after decades of effort, U.S. policy seems to be hitting these new roadblocks with Iran. And we'll explore what some sources call a more realist approach might look like in this changing world, looking at what worked, what didn't, based on our research.
Okay, let's start with this sanctions paradox, as some are calling it. For years, the U.S. playbook has heavily featured sanctions, right? Trying to curb Iran's nuclear program, its regional actions. It's been the main tool. And think back to the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. That reportedly hit hard. Iranian crude exports, they plummeted from maybe 2.5 million barrels a day down to just 400,000 in 2020. Sources even say this pressure cut Iran's defense budget by, 28%. So on paper, that looked pretty effective, didn't it?
It did. Those numbers were significant, no doubt. They showed what sanctions could do when really strictly enforced. But many sources we looked at are quite critical of what happened next under the Biden administration. These critics argue that what they call lax sanctions enforcement allowed Iran's oil exports to just shoot back up, reaching somewhere between 1.6, maybe 1.8 million barrels a day, a huge rebound.
Wow.
And this perceived failure, they claim, let Iran rake in about $200 billion in illicit funds. Money that, as some sources bluntly state, is used to reap chaos region-wide. The argument is basically that inconsistency kills the pressure.
And here's the twist, the real shocker. Despite all this pressure, Iran's resilience is just remarkable. Energy revenues quadrupled from $18 billion in 2020 to, again, that $78 billion figure in 2024. Yeah. And their oil production hit a 46-year high. It almost doesn't compute, does it? How does a sanctioned nation do that?
Well, it leads many analysts to say the power of sanctions has often been oversold. Yes, they create costs, they create difficulties, definitely. But history suggests they rarely force fundamental policy changes on core issues. Take the original nuclear deal, the JCPOA, back in 2015. Sources say part of its success was offering Iran actual tangible relief from sanctions. An exchange that's different from approaches that just keep squeezing while demanding concessions.
Makes sense. A carrot and a stick, not just the stick.
Kind of. And there's another factor, international fatigue, especially with U.S. secondary sanctions. We're seeing more pushback from Europe, China, Russia. They see it as economic coercion. Countries like India openly say they only follow UN sanctions, not unilateral U.S. ones. That really limits the reach.
Okay, so it's clear. Despite the pressure, Iran found ways to, well, not just survive, but thrive financially. Which brings us to the big question. How? How did they build this resilience? Sources point to this shockingly efficient shadow economy, a sanctions-proof system. What does that actually look like?
Well, Iran's been very adaptive. For one, they diversified exports. It's not just crude oil anymore. They're shipping things like condensates, natural gas liquids, ethane, propane, butane, that sort of thing.
Okay.
These are apparently harder to trace, easier to blend with other fuels. They exist in these sort of gray zones of global trade, making it simpler to hide where they came from. And then there's the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They're not just military, they run an economic empire. They control refineries, ports, logistics, even their own fleet of ghost tankers.
Those cankers.
Yeah, ships that turn off their transponders, their AIS systems. They go dark, move oil undetected, then reappear. Plus, they leverage the South Parts gas field, world's largest. Makes Iran the third biggest gas producer globally. It's a huge asset.
But they can't do this in a vacuum, surely. There has to be a buyer, a big one.
And there is China. Sources say China is Iran's primary customer, buying up to 90% of its oil and gas.
90%.
That's the figure reported, often at a big discount, too. So it works for both sides in a way.
So China's the key enabler here.
Absolutely. This relationship has created what some call a parallel financial universe. Transactions happen in Chinese currency, the yuan, through Chinese banks. They use these really complex webs of front companies, transshipment points, and they relabel Iranian oil. Say it came from Iraq or Malaysia or Oman, hides the origin.
Clever, if illicit.
And get this, officially, Chinese customs haven't recorded any Iranian oil imports since 2022. Zero.
But
ship tracking data, independent data, suggests Chinese imports of Iranian crude actually doubled between 2022 and 2024, up to nearly 18 million barrels a day.
doubled, while officially recording zero.
One source called it diplomacy by disguise, trade without traceability. It's quite something. And this system gets stronger because there's this sort of informal alliance of sanctioned states. Iran, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea. They're trading amongst themselves using non-dollar systems, building infrastructure outside U.S. reach. This directly undermines unilateral U.S. sanctions. It gives us a peek at a potential future, a post-dollar world, where U.S. financial leverage is much weaker.
Okay, so that covers the economic side, the shadow system. Really eye-opening. But the U.S. wasn't just using economic tools, right? There's military pressure, too. Let's talk about Operation Midnight Hammer, June 2025. U.S. strikes on 3 key Iranian nuclear sites. Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan, B-2 bombers, Tomahawks. Sounds serious.
It was very serious. President Trump at the time called it a spectacular military success. Initial reports suggested it pushed Iran's nuclear program back by 2 years or more, stopped any imminent weaponization. It definitely showed off America's military power, no question. It was meant to restore deterrence, reassure allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Right, sending a strong message.
Absolutely. Showed capability, showed willingness to act.
Yeah.
But the long-term impact, that's where the debate really is.
Because there were doubts pretty quickly.
Yes. Some early intel assessments, though apparently low confidence, suggested maybe only mere months of setback, not years. And Iran's deputy foreign minister came out and said, quite clearly, their policy has not changed on enrichment. Meaning, okay, you had us, but our long-term goals, they're still the same. It bought time, maybe, but didn't change their strategic path. And this points to a tricky thing about military action. Tactically, it can work, degrade capabilities, but sources argue it often hardens positions on both sides, makes compromises, face-saving deals much harder later. It signals that Washington sees Iran mainly as a security threat, which can shut down diplomatic doors. One source even suggested, somewhat cynically perhaps, that Iran's leaders might almost welcome shifting to a military fight.
Why would they want that?
Because it could rally popular support at home, unite people against an external enemy, distract from economic problems, a classic diversion tactic, maybe.
Okay, let's connect the dots then. Iran's surprising economic strength, this shadow wealth. How does that translate to regional instability? We mentioned that illicit oil money, maybe $1 billion a year. Where's it going?
Sources say it directly funds the Iranian threat network. Groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and crucially, the Houthis in Yemen, it pays for their operations.
And critics point fingers at the Biden administration's approach here.
Yes, some argue that what they call restraint, pointing to figures like responding only 4 times to over 80 attacks by Iran or its proxies on U.S. forces between 2021 and 2023, essentially gave Tehran and its proxies a green light to escalate.
A green light.
That's the claim. This escalation peaked, arguably, with Iran's first ever direct missile and drone attack on Israel from Iranian soil in April 2024, a major step. So this pattern, fueled by money, impacts stability way beyond the Middle East.
And the Red Sea crisis is the most visible example right now, isn't it? These Houthi attacks, backed by Iran, Over 60 attacks in just a few months, late 2023, early 2024. They've severely disrupted global trade.
Severely, about a third of global container traffic uses that route normally. It's a huge bottleneck now.
So let's make it real for the listener. What does this disruption mean for you?
Well, ships are rerouting all the way around Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. That means much higher fuel costs, weeks longer transit times. Weeks. And those costs, they eventually get passed down. Higher prices for consumer goods, electronics, cars, and yeah, gasoline too. It all filters through.
So we're directly paying for that disruption.
In a very real sense, yes. And there's a geopolitical angle too. Reports suggest China and Russia aren't being targeted by the Houthis. Gives their shipping an advantage.
Interesting.
Some analysts see this whole crisis as a distraction. It pulls U.S. focus and resources away from the Indo-Pacific, away from countering China, which Washington calls its most pressing threat.
And Iraq plays a role in this too.
Sources allege Iraq has become a critical hub for Iran, almost a client state. Its oil sector is supposedly used as a laundromat for sanctioned Iranian crude. And critics claim this was enabled by the Biden administration shielding Iraq from penalties, basically letting these transactions slide.
Okay, this naturally leads to a critique of U.S. policy itself. Conservative sources, in particular, argue that the current situation, the chaos, stems from recent policy mistakes. They talk about appeasing Iran, making concessions, maybe overlooking aggression, all in hopes of reviving the nuclear deal. They say that just emboldened Tehran. They also mention alienating regional partners, ignoring security worries of allies like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and pulling out some missile defense systems.
Right, that was a major point of contention.
And finally, neglecting the Abraham Accords. Those Trump-era deals normalizing ties between Israel and some Arab states. The argument is that the initial hesitation to fully embrace those was a strategic miscalculation. Missed chances for cooperation against Iran.
So given those critiques, what do sources suggest as a different way forward, a more realist path as some frame it? Well, several ideas come up. One is differentiated engagement. Basically, distinguish between core threats, like nuclear weapons, where you need to be tough, and broader regional competition, which maybe you manage differently, perhaps through diplomacy or balancing power.
Picking your battles, essentially.
Sort of. Then there's conditional reciprocity. Offer concrete packages. If Iran accepts certain nuclear limits, maybe the U.S. offers specific sanctions relief. A clear give and take. Alliance management is key too. Acknowledge that U.S. and Israeli interests overlap but aren't identical. Requires honest conversations about trade-offs, ensuring U.S. policy serves U.S. interests first.
Makes sense. Interests aren't always perfectly aligned.
Exactly. And finally, realistic timelines. Change in Iran won't happen overnight. Sources stress it will require years, not months. Need to resist pressure for quick fixes that don't last.
And alongside these strategic shifts, there are calls for just tougher enforcement now.
Yeah, Republican senators like Tim Scott are pushing the administration hard, demanding rigorous enforcement action on Iran's oil smuggling. They want a full assessment of the banks helping Iran and more action to cut off weapons going to the Houthis. Basically, use the tools you have, but use them forcefully.
And the overall goal of this kind of realist approach, as presented in the sources, it's really about dropping the fantasy that pressure alone can produce capitulation, especially from a regime like Iran's. It's about accepting the complex reality that lasting agreements usually need mutual accommodation. Both sides have to get something, even if it's just reduced tension.
And the alternative.
The alternative, these sources warn, is just more of the same. Continued cycles of escalation and crisis management, just looching from one crisis to the next, which doesn't really serve anyone's long-term interests. So wrapping this up, we've really unpacked this core tension today, haven't we? The paradox of Iran gaining power despite sanctions, using this shadow economy, helped by China. It's a complicated picture. It really challenges assumptions about how global power works.
It certainly does. We've seen how old tools, like sanctions, might be losing their edge. It forces a rethink of how America engages with the world, maybe in a post-sanctions era. The old strategies might not cut it anymore. It's a profound challenge for U.S. foreign policy, suggesting financial warfare is becoming a much trickier game. Less effective, perhaps.
Yeah, this deep dive really throws a fundamental challenge into sharp relief, and it goes way beyond just Iran. In a world where economic pressure can be sidestepped like this, where deterrence is getting more complex, what new strategies does America need to protect its interests, ensure some kind of global stability? The old playbooks seem increasingly outdated. It leaves us with a really critical question, doesn't it? How do we adapt to a world where resilience maybe more than sanctions, is becoming the real measure of power.